The man everyone in the small town knew as Mr. Johnson lived a quiet life. His farm sat at the edge of a long dirt road, surrounded by wide fields that looked golden in the morning sun. From a distance, his land looked ordinary: an old wooden barn with peeling paint, a farmhouse with a sagging porch, and fences that leaned after years of wind and rain. To the townsfolk, he was just an old black farmer who minded his own business. He went to the market once a week, nodded politely at neighbors, and returned home before sunset. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and never shared much about his past. Children sometimes whispered that his barn was haunted, because they saw lights flickering late at night or heard strange sounds, like heavy footsteps or the clang of metal. Adults brushed it off, saying old barns always creaked and groaned in the wind. Nobody asked Mr. Johnson about it. Nobody dared. He carried himself in a way that told people to keep their distance, not rude, but firm. Every morning, before the sun even touched the horizon, he woke up. His hands, though scarred and wrinkled, were steady. He fed the chickens, milked the cow, and stacked bales of hay with a strength that surprised anyone who noticed. Though his back was bent with age, his movements were precise, controlled, and sharp. It was as if every task, no matter how small, was part of a routine he had followed for decades. He lived alone, but he was never careless. His tools were always lined up neatly. His rifle, though dusty, was always oiled. He locked his doors every night, even though the town was quiet and crime was rare. He had eyes that noticed everything. A truck that slowed too long near his farm, strangers who stopped at the gas station nearby, or even the faint change in the wind that told him a storm was coming. No one knew where he came from. Some said he had been born in the South and moved north after hard times. Others said he had once worked in the city and retired to the countryside. A few guessed he had been in the military, but those were just rumor stories told by men at the bar after too many drinks. Whatever the truth was, Mr. Johnson never corrected them. He let people believe whatever they wanted. At church, he sat in the back pew, silent and respectful. At the market, he bought only what he needed and left quickly. He never joined town meetings or gossip circles. Yet, whenever storms knocked down a neighbor's fence, or when a tractor broke down, he was the first to show up, fixing things quietly and leaving before thanks could be given. People called him reserved, but those who looked closely saw something else in him, a weight in his eyes, as if he carried memories too heavy to share. Inside his farmhouse, the walls told a different story. In his living room hung no family photos, no smiling faces, no children's drawings. Instead, there were old medals tucked in a drawer, uniforms folded away in a chest, and letters yellowed with age. At night, when the farm was still and only the crickets sang, he sometimes sat by the window, staring out into the dark fields. His hand would grip a worn silver dog tag, his thumb brushing over the engraved numbers. Whatever battles he had fought, whatever losses he had endured, they lived in his silence. The townsfolk only saw the farmer who sold eggs and corn. They never saw the man who still woke from nightmares in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, reaching instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. They never saw the way his eyes scanned every crowd, every stranger, every movement, always assessing, always prepared. For Mr. Johnson, the farm wasn't just a home. It was a place to stay hidden, a place to keep the world at a safe distance. His barn, though old and creaking, was more than it appeared. To outsiders, it was just a storage place for hay, tools, and rusty farm equipment. But to him, it was something else. It was his fortress, his workshop, and his sanctuary. Over the years, he had reinforced its doors, repaired its roof, and kept it cleaner than most people kept their homes. The barn smelled of oil and wood, of rope and iron. Some tools hung on the walls, others hidden in secret compartments only he knew about. It was the kind of order only a soldier would keep, though no one in town had ever stepped inside to notice, though he was old. There was a calm strength about him, the kind of strength that doesn't fade with time. It wasn't in his muscles, it was in his presence. A man who had faced chaos and survived didn't need to boast. He simply carried himself in a way that warned trouble to stay away. But trouble was coming. The cartel that would soon cross his land had no idea who he truly was. To them, he was just another old man in the countryside. They saw only weakness in his age, only vulnerability in his solitude. They would learn, too late, that beneath the surface of this quiet farmer was a Marine commander who had once led men into battles far deadlier than anything they had ever seen. And as the sun set on that peaceful farm, painting the barn in shadows of red and gold, Mr. Johnson stood on his porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. To anyone passing by, it was just an old man watching the evening sky. But behind those eyes, the instincts of a soldier never slept. The cartel had been growing restless. For weeks, they had been moving across the countryside, looking for a safe place to stash their weapons, drugs, and cash. Cities were too risky, too many cameras, too many police patrols, too many eyes watching. They needed a quiet spot, a place no one would ever think to search. Somewhere far enough from town, but still easy to reach when they needed to pick up their goods. That was when one of their scouts noticed the old barn sitting on the edge of farmland. From the road, it looked forgotten, leaning with age. The paint was peeling, the wood faded gray, and weeds grew wild around the fences. The farmhouse nearby seemed just as worn down, with its sagging porch and cracked windows. To the cartel, it was perfect. They didn't care about the old man who lived there. They saw him only once, driving a rusty pickup truck into town. He looked slow, gray-haired, and harmless. An old black farmer, alone and weak. They laughed when they spotted him. What threat could he possibly pose? To them, he was invisible, too old to notice, too old to fight back, too old to matter. The cartel was bold, but also arrogant. They believed fear gave them power. Everywhere they went, people bowed their heads, handed over money, and kept their mouths shut. They thought this old farmer would be no different. Just another victim. Just another nobody. They never asked themselves why his fences, though worn, still stood straight. They didn't notice how the locks on his barn door weren't cheap, but heavy, reinforced with steel. They didn't notice the sharp eyes that followed their truck from behind dusty windows. They didn't realize that every time they slowed near his farm, he wrote down the details, the sound of their engine, the license plate numbers, the way the men inside carried themselves. But the cartel wasn't thinking about details. They were thinking about convenience. They needed a hideout, and the barn looked like it hadn't been touched by anything serious in years. One of the younger men laughed and said, "It's perfect. Old barns like that, nobody checks them. Cops won't even care." Another added, "That farmer won't even know what's going on. He'll be too scared to say a word." The leader of the group nodded. To him, it was already decided. They would use the barn. They would break in at night, move their stash inside, and come back when needed. If the farmer gave them trouble, they'd handle it the way they always did, with threats, with fear. Maybe worse, what none of them understood was this. They were walking straight into a trap. Though it wasn't a trap built with wires and explosives. It was a trap built out of experience, discipline, and the instincts of a man who had once commanded Marines on the battlefield. The barn they thought was weak and empty was, in truth, a fortress waiting for intruders. On the night they chose, the sky was dark, heavy with clouds. The moon hid behind them, leaving the fields in shadow. The cartel's black SUV rolled slowly down the dirt road, its tires crunching against gravel. They parked just beyond the line of trees, far enough to stay hidden, close enough to reach the barn on foot. They moved quickly, carrying crowbars and flashlights, their voices low. One man joked, This old man's probably snoring already. He won't even hear us." They all chuckled, confident in their strength. To them, this was routine. Break the lock, stash the goods, leave before dawn. But as they approached the barn, something felt strange. The night was too still. The wind had stopped. The crickets had gone silent. One of the younger men glanced around nervously, but the others ignored it. They pushed forward, certain nothing could go wrong. What they didn't know was that Mr. Johnson was already awake. He had seen their headlights from his porch. He had been expecting them. For weeks, he had noticed the strange truck circling his land. He knew trouble was coming. And like every soldier before a mission, he had prepared. Inside the barn, ropes, chains, and tools weren't just lying around. They were placed carefully, ready to be used. In the farmhouse, a shotgun leaned by the door and a pistol rested under the table. The old Marine had no fear in his heart, only patience. He had faced far worse enemies than these cartel men. He knew their type: loud, arrogant, careless. He also knew that their greatest weakness was believing the man they targeted was weak. The cartel reached the barn doors. One of them raised a crowbar, ready to pry it open. The lock clanged against the metal, the sound sharp in the quiet night. Another man whispered, "See, easy, nobody's home." But someone was home. Someone who had been waiting. The cartel thought this was the start of their victory. They thought they had chosen the perfect hiding place. What they didn't realize was that they had just chosen the wrong barn and the wrong man. Asterisk. The lock snapped with a sharp metallic crack, and the heavy barn doors groaned as the cartel forced them open. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts, swirling in the thin beams of their flashlights. The men laughed quietly as they slipped inside, their boots crunching against the old wooden floor. To them, it smelled of hay, animals, and age. Just another barn. Just another easy job. But they didn't know that every step they took was being heard. Every careless laugh, every scrape of metal against wood, was noticed by someone who had spent years surviving ambushes in darker places than this. Mr. Johnson was already inside. He hadn't waited in his house. He had moved when he saw the headlights. His shadow blended with the barn itself. He stood still, silent, breathing slow, watching. His figure was hidden behind stacked hay bales, his eyes steady and sharp. In the darkness, he wasn't an old farmer anymore. He was the commander again. The cartel fanned out. One man checked the far corner, tapping loose boards with his crowbar. Another shined his light across the rafters. A third pulled a duffel bag from under his jacket, ready to drop it on the barn floor. None of them noticed a faint movement above them, where Mr. Johnson had climbed the loft ladder long before they arrived. He studied them like prey. Their movements were sloppy. Their grips on their weapons were weak. Their breathing was too loud. He knew within seconds who was the leader, the man giving quiet hand signals, the one who looked the most confident. Years of command taught him to see patterns in chaos. And he saw something else too: arrogance. The kind of arrogance that got men killed. One of the younger men kicked over an old bucket, the clatter echoing through the barn. "Told you, nothing here," he whispered, laughing nervously. His flashlight beam passed close to the ladder, but didn't stop. He was inches away from spotting the old commander. But luck, or perhaps fate, kept the secret. The leader motioned for silence. He crouched down, running his hand along the wooden floor. "This will work," he muttered. "We'll stash the bags here, and nobody will ever know." Nobody. Except the man already planning their downfall. From the loft, Mr. Johnson's hand brushed against a coiled rope. His mind worked fast. He remembered setting up pulleys years ago to lift hay. Now, in the hands of a Marine, simple farming tools became weapons. He didn't rush. Patience was his greatest weapon. He let the intruders get comfortable. He let them believe they were safe. The barn seemed to close in around them. The beams creaked as if the old building itself was holding its breath. The shadows stretched long across the walls, swallowing the men in black jackets. And then, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." It was low, steady, and carried the weight of command. The cartel froze. Flashlights jerked upward, beams scattering across hay and wood. One man cursed under his breath, spinning in circles. "Who's there?" Another whispered, "It's just the old man, don't worry." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Mr. Johnson didn't move yet. He let his words sink in. He wanted them unsettled, nervous, doubting. He knew fear was as powerful as any bullet. The leader snarled, trying to regain control. "Old man, come out before you get hurt." His voice was confident, but his eyes darted. He wasn't used to being hunted. He wasn't used to being watched. From above, Johnson pulled the rope. A pulley groaned, and a heavy bale of hay swung down, smashing into the floor near the intruders. Dust exploded in the air, blinding them. They coughed, stumbled, and raised their weapons in panic. But the barn was too big, too dark. And the enemy they faced was everywhere and nowhere. First mistake. Johnson said calmly from the shadows. The men spun toward the sound. But he was already gone, slipping down the ladder with the ease of a man half his age. He moved like smoke, silent and quick, using every shadow as cover. He was not fighting on their terms. He was making them fight on his dot. One man shouted, "I saw him." "Over there?" He rushed forward, crowbar raised, but tripped over a rake that had been left angled on purpose. He crashed to the floor, cursing. The others laughed nervously, but the laughter didn't last. They were starting to realize this wasn't just a barn. It was a battlefield, and the farmer they had mocked wasn't hiding out of fear. He was hunting. The leader's jaw tightened. "Spread out." "Find him." But even he felt it now, the chill in the air. The weight of unseen eyes. Mr. Johnson had turned the barn into a place of shadows. And in shadows, he was the master. The barn was quiet again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This time, it was heavy, tense, charged with something the cartel couldn't name. The air felt thicker, the shadows darker. The men shifted nervously, their boots creaking on the wooden floorboards. They had come looking for an easy hideout, but what they found instead was an old man who spoke like a ghost from their nightmares. Mr. Johnson crouched in the corner, his breath steady, his body still. He wasn't thinking of himself as a farmer anymore. The weight of the years seemed to slip off him like an old coat. His shoulders straightened. His muscles tightened with purpose. The instincts that had been buried under quiet days and lonely nights were rising, one by one. The commander was waking. He remembered jungles thick with vines, deserts burning with heat, and cities where danger hid behind every corner. He remembered leading young Marines, shouting orders under gunfire. Watching men he trained put their trust in him with their lives. Those memories didn't weaken him. They sharpened him. They reminded him of who he really was. The cartel thought they were hunters. But they didn't know what it meant to face a man who had lived through wars, who had trained to fight with nothing but his hands, his mind and his will. Johnson moved quickly now, his steps silent on the barn floor. He grabbed a coil of rope, tying it across a doorway just above ankle height. In the darkness, it was invisible. One careless step and a man would fall hard. Next, he slid an old shovel against the wall at an angle. If knocked over, it would crash down with a sound like a gunshot, loud enough to send them scrambling. His tools were his weapons. A pitchfork leaned by the haystack. A rusty chain hung from a beam. Even the farm animals' feeding troughs could become shields if used right. To most men, these were just farm supplies. To Johnson, they were asset pieces of a battlefield he knew better than anyone. Meanwhile, the cartel leader whispered harshly to his men, "He's old. He's alone. Don't lose your heads. We scare him, we take the barn, and we're done." But his voice didn't carry the same confidence anymore. He felt something crawling up his spine, a presence, a force he couldn't explain. He told himself it was just nerves, but deep down, he knew better. He had underestimated the man they were dealing with. One of the younger men kicked at the hay, muttering, "This is stupid. Let's just grab him." He turned a corner too fast, and his foot caught the rope. He toppled forward, hitting the ground with a sharp cry. His flashlight clattered across the floor, spinning in circles before the others could move. A deep voice cut through the dark. Second mistake. The fallen man scrambled up, fear flooding his eyes. He felt for the first time that they weren't in control. The barn wasn't theirs. It belonged to the shadow watching them. Johnson's hands didn't shake. He had no fear, only focus. Age had taken his speed, but not his precision. Every step he made had purpose. Every sound he allowed was chosen to rattle their nerves. He wanted them unsettled. He wanted them angry, reckless. Because reckless men made easy targets, he thought about the wars he had fought, the soldiers he had led. He had taught them that survival came not from strength alone, but from discipline, patience, and awareness. Now, he would teach the same lesson to these intruders, except their classroom would be this barn. And their punishment would be far worse than a failing grade. The cartel huddled near the center of the barn, flashlights trembling in their hands. The beams shook across the wooden walls, across hooks, ropes, and beams that seemed to reach for them. One whispered, "It's like he's everywhere at once." The leader growled, trying to hold his men together. "He's just one man. Stop acting like kids." But even he was sweating now, his grip tight on the pistol hidden under his jacket. From the shadows, Johnson prepared his next move. He wasn't rushing into a fight. He was shaping it, turning the barn into a stage where every move the cartel made would play into his hands. He wasn't the prey, and he wasn't just the hunter either. He was the commander, orchestrating the field, controlling the fear, and breaking them piece by piece. Above them, the rafters creaked softly as he shifted his weight. The sound made one man spin and fire his gun into the dark. The shot thundered through the barn, the echo deafening. Splinters rained down. But he hit nothing. Nothing except empty space. The old Marine smiled faintly in the dark. He had seen it before, men wasting bullets on shadows, giving themselves away. Fear was already eating them alive. For the first time in years, Johnson felt alive too. Not because of the fight, but because the soldier in him, the one he thought had been buried with time, was alive again. His farm, his barn, his land, it wasn't just property. It was his post. And he was on duty. The awakening was complete. He was no longer Mr. Johnson, the quiet farmer. He was Commander Johnson, the Marine who had led men into hell and come back. And now, the cartel would learn what it meant to trespass on a soldier's ground. The barn felt alive with tension. Dust drifted in the thin beams of light, settling on the faces of the cartel men who now stood shoulder to shoulder, their nerves fraying. They had come expecting silence, weakness, and fear. Instead, they found whispers in the dark, ropes snapping at their feet, and an unseen enemy that seemed to know their every move. Commander Johnson crouched in the shadows, his breath calm, his eyes steady. His heart did not race like theirs. For him, this was familiar. He had been here before, in jungles where the enemy outnumbered him, in alleys where danger waited in every shadow. The barn was smaller, quieter, but the battlefield was the same. And on a battlefield, he knew exactly when to strike. One of the younger men muttered, "We should leave. This isn't worth it." His voice cracked and his hands shook as he raised his flashlight. The leader snapped at him, "Shut up. We finished this. He's just an old man." But even as he spoke, the leader's eyes flicked nervously across the rafters, betraying the doubt in his heart. Johnson waited for that doubt to spread. He let it build. He let their fear sharpen until they jumped at every creak of the old wood. Then, when the moment was perfect, he moved. A length of chain rattled as he pulled it free from the wall. In one fluid motion, he swung it down. The heavy metal clanged across the floor, striking the boots of the nearest intruder. The man yelped, stumbling backward. Before he could recover, Johnson stepped from the shadows, his figure rising tall and sharp against the dim light. "Third mistake," he said, his voice cold as steel. The man barely had time to react. Johnson's arm shot forward, his grip seizing the crowbar from the man's hand. With a twist born of years of training, he wrenched it free and shoved him hard against the wooden post. The sound of impact echoed like a gunshot. Panic rippled through the others. One fired his pistol wildly, the shot tearing through a hay bale, sending straw raining down. Another lunged forward, but Johnson was already gone, slipping back into the dark. He didn't linger in the open. He struck, then vanished, leaving only fear behind. The fallen man groaned, clutching his chest. His flashlight rolled across the ground, its beam flickering against the ceiling. The cartel leader cursed and barked orders, but his men no longer moved with confidence. They swung their lights back and forth, searching desperately for the shadow that had already melted away. From above, the old Marine watched them scramble. He could smell their fear. Their arrogance was gone now, stripped away in a single strike. And he knew what came next. Chaos. The youngest cartel member backed toward the door, his eyes wide. "This is wrong. He's not normal," he whispered. His voice trembled, his hands shaking so badly that the gun in his grip rattled. He turned as if to flee, but the leader grabbed him by the collar. "You move, you die. We stay." Johnson let the exchange play out. He wanted them distracted, divided. Fear was a weapon too, sharper than any blade. He would use it until it broke them. The barn creaked again as he shifted his weight. Another man spun and fired, the muzzle flash bright for a split second. But the bullet hit nothing but wood. The gunpowder burned the air, the smell thick, and the sound left their ears ringing. Then Johnson struck again. He dropped from the loft with surprising speed for a man his age, landing behind the man who had just fired. Before the intruder could turn, Johnson's arm wrapped around his neck, pulling him into a chokehold. The man struggled, thrashing. But the old commander's grip was iron. In seconds, he collapsed, unconscious. And Johnson lowered him silently to the floor. The others spun at the sound, their flashlights jerking wildly. But once more, Johnson was gone. He moved like a shadow, his body melting into the dark corners of the barn. The leader's voice shook now, though he tried to hide it. "Spread out. Find him," he barked. But his men hesitated, eyes darting, their courage crumbling. None of them wanted to take the first step. Johnson watched from the dark, his chest rising slow and steady. He knew the first strike was always the most important. It wasn't just about taking down an enemy, it was about shattering their confidence, about making them realize they were no longer in control. He had done that now. The barn was his battlefield. Their fear was his weapon, and this was only the beginning. The barn was no longer a hiding place. It had become a battlefield. The air was heavy with dust, the smell of gunpowder, and the sharp scent of fear. Every creak of the wooden beams echoed like a warning. The cartel men, once bold and laughing, now moved like hunted animals, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Two of their men were already down, one groaning on the floor, the other unconscious. That alone was enough to shake them. They weren't used to losing. They weren't used to fighting someone who didn't run, didn't beg, didn't break. Commander Johnson crouched in the rafters, his eyes scanning below. His breath was steady, his body controlled. He had faced entire squads before. These men, with their loud boots and shaky hands, were nothing compared to the soldiers and warlords he had outsmarted in the past. Still, he gave them the same respect as any enemy. Underestimating a threat got men killed. He would not make that mistake. The leader barked orders, but his voice cracked. Stay sharp. He's one man. Don't let his words cut short when a pitchfork came flying from the shadows, clattering against the ground at his feet. It didn't hit him, but it didn't have to. The sound was enough. All three men spun, firing wildly into the dark. Bullets tore through hay bales, splinters flew, and the barn shook with thunder. But Johnson wasn't there. He had already moved. Fourth mistake, his voice echoed, low and calm. The cartel members cursed, their lights sweeping frantically across the barn. One of them stumbled back toward the doors, desperate to escape, but his boot caught on the rope Johnson had set earlier. He fell hard, his gun skidding out of reach. Before he could rise, a heavy boot pressed into his chest. He looked up and saw the old farmer's eyes staring down at him. Those eyes weren't weak. They weren't tired. They were the eyes of a soldier who had seen war and lived through it. The fallen man froze, his breath catching in his throat. Johnson leaned close and whispered, "You came to the wrong barn." Then, with a swift motion, he struck the man across the temple with the butt of his own gun. Silence followed. The man slumped, unconscious. The others panicked. One shouted, "He's here," and fired again, the shot grazing a beam. Another tried to circle around, but Johnson was faster. He grabbed the chain hanging from the ceiling, swung it down, and wrapped it tight around the man's wrist. With one hard yank, he pulled him off balance. The man crashed into a stack of hay bales, his weapon clattering to the floor. The leader watched, his heart pounding. This wasn't a fight anymore, it was a nightmare. His men, trained in cruelty and arrogance, were falling one by one to an old farmer who fought like a ghost. "Show yourself." The leader roared, his voice shaking. He aimed his pistol at the darkness, waiting for movement. His finger trembled on the trigger. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and then he heard it. Slow, steady footsteps on the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. They grew louder, closer, until a shadow moved into the edge of his light. Johnson stepped forward, no longer hiding, his shoulders squared, his face calm. He didn't look like prey. He looked like judgment itself. The leader fired. The shot cracked through the barn, but Johnson had already moved. The bullet hit wood, splintering the wall. In 2 strides, Johnson was on him. His hand struck the pistol aside, his elbow slammed into the leader's chest, and the gun flew from his grip. The fight was brutal. The leader swung hard, landing a fist against Johnson's jaw, but the old Marine barely flinched. He countered with a sharp strike to the ribs, forcing the younger man to gasp for air. The leader tried again, but Johnson's knee drove into his stomach, dropping him to the ground. "You think age makes me weak," Johnson growled, gripping the man's collar. "I've buried men twice your size. I've fought wars you can't even imagine. And you," he slammed the leader against the barn post, the wood cracking, "you thought you could break into my home." The leader spat blood, his pride shattering along with his ribs. He looked around and saw his men scattered, some unconscious, some groaning, none able to stand. His arrogance, his confidence, all of it was gone. Johnson didn't finish him yet. He wanted the man to see it, to understand it, to know that the barn he thought was weak had been his undoing. The old commander stepped back, his eyes sharp. Around him, the barn was silent once more. The cartel had come with numbers, weapons, and bravado. They had found discipline, strategy, and the unbreakable will of a Marine. The battle in the barn was over, and the cartel had lost. But for the leader, one final truth was about to be revealed. The barn was silent at last. Dust still hung in the air, drifting slowly through the beams of moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the roof. The smell of gunpowder lingered, mixed with sweat and blood. On the wooden floor, cartel men lay scattered, some unconscious, others groaning softly, all broken in body and spirit. Commander Johnson stood tall among them. His chest rose steady with each breath, his face calm, his eyes sharp. He looked less like an old farmer now, and more like what he truly was, a soldier who had never lost his edge. His hands, though scarred and weathered, still carried the strength of command. The cartel leader lay against a post, clutching his ribs, his pride bleeding out with every breath. His eyes, once arrogant and cruel, now stared wide with fear. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. Johnson stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. He crouched down until his eyes met the younger man's. There was no anger in his face, no rage, only cold truth. "You thought I was just an old farmer," he said quietly. "But I've led men into wars you'll never understand. I've buried brothers on foreign soil. I fought enemies who would tear you apart before you could draw a breath. And you," he paused, letting the words sink in, "you thought you could take my barn." The leader swallowed hard. His lips trembled. Who are you?" Johnson didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small silver tag, its edges worn smooth by time. The moonlight glinted off the engraved numbers and letters. He held it up between them. "Marine Corps," he said simply. "Commander." Retired, but never broken. The cartel leader's breath caught in his throat. The weight of those words hit harder than any strike. Suddenly, everything made sense, the precision, the traps, the calm voice in the dark, the way the old man fought like a machine built for war. They hadn't walked into a barn. They had walked into a soldier's fortress. Johnson tucked the dog tag back into his pocket and rose to his feet. He looked over the defeated men sprawled across the floor. None of them dared move. None dared speak. They knew now. They understood. He stepped toward the barn doors and pulled them open. The night air rushed in, cool and fresh, carrying the sounds of crickets that had gone silent during the fight. For a moment, Johnson stood framed in the doorway, his figure tall and unyielding against the pale moonlight. Then he turned back to the cartel leader, one last time. "Remember this night," he said. His voice was steady, but it carried like thunder. "You thought age made me weak. You thought my silence meant fear. But you were wrong. I am a Marine. I was trained to fight until my last breath. And if you ever come back here, if you ever threaten my land again, you won't walk away at all." The leader lowered his eyes. He couldn't hold that gaze. He couldn't answer. All he could do was nod weakly, his pride shattered beyond repair. Johnson left them there, broken and humiliated. He didn't need to finish them. He knew the truth would haunt them far worse than any wound. They had tried to break into an old black farmer's barn, and instead they had awakened a Marine commander. They would never forget it. Back at his porch, Johnson sat down slowly, the night quiet around him once more. He lit a small lantern and set it on the table. His hands trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from age catching up to him after the storm had passed. He took a deep breath, staring out at the fields that stretched into the darkness, He wasn't a man who bragged. He wasn't a man who boasted. The world would never know what had happened in that barn. But he knew. And so did the men who had walked in full of arrogance and walked out carrying the weight of truth. For Johnson, it wasn't about glory. It was about defending what was his land, his peace, his honor. And as the barn stood tall in the moonlight, its walls scarred but unbroken, it became more than wood and nails. It became a symbol of its owner, a soldier who might grow old but would never grow weak. The cartel had made their mistake, and now they would carry the memory of that mistake for the rest of their lives. Asterisk, the barn was quiet again. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, tense silence of before. It was calm. Still, the kind of silence that came after a storm had passed and the land was breathing. Again, the cartel men were gone. Johnson hadn't killed them. He didn't need to. He let them stumble out of the barn, beaten, humiliated, and broken. They limped to their vehicle, dragging their unconscious comrades, their flashlights dim, and their pride shattered. Not one of them dared to look back. Not one of them spoke a word. The truth weighed too heavily on their shoulders. They had entered the barn thinking they were wolves. They left knowing they had been lambs. Johnson stood at the doorway long after they were gone, his sharp eyes following the trail of dust their SUV left on the dirt road. He didn't move until the night swallowed them completely. Then, slowly, he closed the barn doors. The lock clicked into place with finality. He walked across his yard, his boots crunching against the gravel. The farmhouse porch light cast a soft glow, welcoming him home. His body ached, his jaw throbbed where he'd been struck, and his knuckles were raw. He was old, yes, but the fight had reminded him of something. He wasn't done yet. Inside the house, he poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table. His hand brushed against the dog tag resting in his pocket. He pulled it out, laying it flat against the wood. The engraved numbers caught the faint light. He stared at it for a long moment. He thought of the Marines he had led. Men who had laughed in the face of danger, men who had followed him into fire without hesitation. Some of them had lived. Many had not. Their voices still lived in his memory. And tonight, he felt them close again, as if they had stood with him in the barn. Still got it. "Commander," he whispered to himself with a faint smile. The next morning, the town woke to whispers. Someone had seen the cartel SUV speeding down the highway in the dead of night, windows cracked, men inside, battered and pale. No one knew what had happened, but stories spread fast. By noon, people said the cartel had gone after the old farmer. By evening, the whispers grew louder. They had gone in bold and come out broken. Nobody dared ask Johnson directly. At the market, neighbors glanced his way, their eyes full of unspoken questions. He only gave his usual nod, bought his supplies, and returned to his farm. The truth wasn't theirs to know. It was his, but the cartel remembered. Oh, they remembered. Word spread through their ranks about the old man in the countryside. Some called him a demon. Others said he was a ghost of war who couldn't be killed. Whatever the version, the message was the same. Stay away from his land. Stay away from his barn. For Johnson, life returned to routine. He woke at dawn, tended to his animals, repaired fences, and stacked hay. To anyone watching, he was the same quiet farmer he had always been. But something had changed inside him. He no longer felt like a man waiting for time to finish him. He felt alive again, reminded that discipline, courage, and will never truly age. At night, he would sit on his porch, watching the fields under the stars. The barn stood tall in the distance, its scars visible in the moonlight. Each mark on its wood was a reminder, a story written in silence. And to Johnson, it was proof that even in the quiet corners of the world, battles still found him. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never had. But if trouble came again, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready and far away. In the shadows of their criminal world, the cartel told stories about him about the night they broke into an old black farmer's barn and discovered he was something far more dangerous. A retired Marine commander. Some stories fade. Others grow into legends. This one, whispered in fear, would last.